Now, to kick off our afternoon plenary session, we'll be having two more keynote addresses. First up, I'd like to welcome the Honorable Christopher Krebs, who is the Director of the newly renamed Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, otherwise known as CISA. Mr. Krebs was originally sworn in as the Undersecretary for the predecessor of CISA, the National Protection and Programs Directorate. Now, as the Director of CISA, Mr. Krebs oversees CISA's efforts to defend civil networks, secure federal facilities, manage systemic risk to national critical functions, and work with stakeholders to raise the security baseline of the nation's cyber and physical infrastructure. Before serving as CISA's director, Mr. Krebs was appointed in August of 2017 as the Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection, having joined DHS in March of 2017 as Senior Counsel to the Secretary. Before joining DHS, he was a member of Microsoft's U.S. Government Affairs team as the Director for Cybersecurity Policy, where he led Microsoft's U.S. policy work on cybersecurity and technology issues. I'd like to just remind you all that after Chris Krebs speaks, he will be taking questions from the audience. So if you could begin to think of some questions that you may like to ask him. And when you come up to the microphones, if you could please keep it short, identify yourself and ask your questions, I'd really appreciate it so we can stay on time. So I'd like to welcome the Honorable Christopher Krebs to the podium now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It really is an honor to be here today for multiple reasons. One, I've had the pleasure of working with Catherine and the Atlantic Council team for many years. So to actually be able to come up here and give a keynote is a great honor, both professionally and personally based on relationships. But it's also an honor because I'm stepping in for Secretary Nielsen, who was also always a big supporter of the Atlantic Council and Catherine in this effort. So to be able to come up here and represent her, such a big believer in international cooperation, cybersecurity, I hope I can do half the job that she was able to do. So what I kind of want to talk about today is where things are in terms of the Homeland Security space and how my team, the agency and CISA, is evolving to address emerging threats, but really how the landscape has changed and how we have changed in response. So the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency was established in November of 2018. Prior to that, as Catherine said, it was the National Protection and Programs Directorate. As I've described it, it was a bit of an island of misfit toys. Took various security and protection focused parts of the department and crammed them together because they frankly didn't fit in FEMA or TSA or CBP or elsewhere. So it was almost a holding spot. But that was 2003, 2007, 2009. When the department was established in 2003, 16 years ago, it was established in response to a terrorist-focused threat. Frankly, nation-state threats, nation-state adversaries were not top of mind. They were not driving investment decisions on the Hill. They were not driving policy conversations in the National Security Council. But over the last 16 years, there's no question that understanding, that appreciation of what the world looks like has shifted dramatically. And it's not just that nation states have gotten more competent, more capable, more brazen in some cases, but it's also due to the fact that we've changed the way or evolved the way, expanded the ways we interact with technology. Not a day goes by where somebody doesn't find some new and questionable way of using technology, connecting to the internet, sharing personal information. So it's up to us to think through what are the implications and how do we manage risk that's only growing on a daily basis. So as time passed, the investments changed, and Congress recognized, not with a little bit of prodding, but a lot of prodding, from not just the Trump administration, but the prior administration, the Obama administration, that the federal government needs a clearly recognized single point of entry, single point of coordination for critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, risk management. So, enter the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. Now, when I talk about how I view the agency and how we work with industry and how we work with state and local partners in the federal government, it's not that we're the nation's risk manager, because at the end of the day, I'm not pushing buttons or turning dials to manage risk. To put it, I think, a little bit more accurately, we're the nation's risk advisor. We work with our partners in the intelligence community and the law enforcement community and the international community to understand what the threat landscape looks like. But it's more than just understanding what the threat looks like, it's understanding what it means, putting it in context, understanding how it would impact the critical infrastructure community. So it's about understanding what's going on out there, what the adversary is doing, but contextualizing that risk in a network perspective, giving the blue team, the network defenders, the advantages they need to be able to act, to be able to protect their networks, to put them in a position to be successful. So to do this, I think we have to step back a little bit and look at what the adversary space looks like. So this has kind of evolved over time, but increasingly thinking about a 2+3 framework. The most active nation-state adversaries right now are Russia and China, and then we also have Iran, North Korea, and then the extremist space. Those adversaries that are developing capabilities and maybe more regionally focused, but are showing all the signs and all the potential of evolving into a truly cyber-capable adversary. So this 2+3 framework, think about everything we've done, whether it's my team and the US CERT team issuing advisories over the last 2 years. For Russia, we've issued a number of technical alerts, indicators of compromise, launched a number of webinars and other advisory capabilities to share our understanding of what the bad guys are doing. Whether it was the Grizzly Step campaign after the 2016 election interference, and you better believe I'm going to come back to that today, but it's also joining with the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Center in issuing a joint bulletin alongside the FBI on network infrastructure device compromise at a global scale. But we've also seen Russia attempt to compromise energy infrastructure. How? By exploiting trusted relationships with the supply chain and vendors. Better believe I'm going to come back to that today. In terms of China, we've also seen, most recently in December rather, the Department of Justice indict a number of Chinese cyber actors for a global scale campaign compromising managed service providers and cloud service providers. And what this represents more than anything to us is that the adversary is getting much more efficient, much more effective in the way that they target critical infrastructure. There was a great panel earlier on norms of behavior. Intellectual property theft for commercial gain remains off limits. So what we're seeing is rather than the Chinese actors going directly at individual companies, they're going to the points of aggregation. They understand the business decisions and the business processes domestically here in our infrastructure, but not just in the US, but in Europe and elsewhere, that more and more companies are looking to save money, be more efficient, and be more productive. And so they're going to these managed service providers, which provides the adversary or the actor a much more efficient way of getting to the stuff they want to get. And that's the intellectual property, that's PII, so on and so forth. In terms of Iran, we've issued reports on the Mabna Institute and some of their password spraying attacks. In Korea, I could stand up here for hours and talk about North Korean activity, particularly when it comes to financially motivated activities. But under the Hidden Cobra campaign, we've issued a number of indicators of compromise on what is a persistently active adversary. So as the adversary space continues to expand and grow, the good news is the international partnership space continues to grow. Over the last several years, we've only increased our engagements with foreign partners. Just recently, my agency, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, deployed an analyst to London to embed with the NCSC, with the National Cyber Security Center. That's a model that we're going to continue to grow with international partners so that we can coordinate on joint action and we can coordinate on joint bulletins at a very minimum. But it's also a day-to-day engagement with computer emergency response teams globally. On a daily basis, we work CERT to CERT across the globe. And it's not just an analyst-to-analyst exchange, but we also have 12 partners that are hooked up to our automated indicator sharing platform, the automated pushing back and forth of indicators of compromise. These are the sorts of engagements that build trust, that build partnerships, that operationalize partnerships. What does that lead to ultimately? Well, my team deploys incident response capabilities, technical assessment globally. It's not just Europe, it's South America, it's Asia, it's all over the world. We're there, we're partners. When the call comes in, we're standing ready to ask, and we can deploy anywhere on very short order, not just domestically, but globally. So as we continue to think through what the evolution of DHS cybersecurity capabilities are, it's beyond information sharing. Information sharing is the minimum bar. We have to get beyond information sharing, even beyond information exchange, and we have to focus on operationalizing cybersecurity, operationalizing partnerships. So how are we doing that? Well, a couple ways, but to start with, we're evolving the way we're thinking about risk. We're moving beyond a 16-sector model where it's just the energy sector we're concerned about or just the financial services sector. What we're trying to do is, as the artificialities of the economic argument that 16 sectors exists here, as those dissolve because of the cross-cutting relationships, the ICT underpinnings of these sectors, what we're finding is that more than anything, the sameness of the attack surface far outweighs any of the uniqueness of the sector. And what does that really mean? It's that we're all running on business systems. In the hard infrastructure space, they're all running on operational technology. And they're only, particularly in the OT space, there are only so many companies and organizations that are playing in that space with very stylized and tailored deployments at the edge. So it's critically important that we work together and share information and work to understand what the real risk is across those sectors. So as these 16 sectors kind of fall away and we're looking at functions, we're trying to get to a better, more systemic understanding of risk. What are those things that actually matter? What are those things that, if interrupted at the literal end of the day, the economy would crater? How do we identify those things? So last summer up in New York City, Secretary Nielsen launched the National Risk Management Center within my agency that is that cross-cutting across the federal government, but also cross-cutting across industry and the international community to identify those national critical functions, those things that are so systemically important that they have to continue on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. That should roll out next week, but we're in the process of finalizing, and we're looking at about 57 national critical functions. Sounds like a lot. How are 57 things critical? Well, when you scatter 57 things across 16 sectors, it's actually becomes pretty apparent what we're trying to accomplish here. Again, what are those 4 or 5 things out of the financial services sector? What are those 4 or 5 things out of the energy sector that really, truly matter? And it's not necessarily paying the bill every month, but it's ensuring that we can transport fuel for baseload generation purposes to generate electricity. So it's stitching these things together and characterizing where the true risk is. Now, what that's going to do for us is when we get an understanding that an adversary has developed a capability to manipulate industrial control systems, what we're able to do is take that and cascade it across the critical functions and say, here are 23, I'm making that number up right now, 23 critical functions that could be held at risk because they've developed this capability within industrial control systems. But what's also coming to light as we try to evolve our understanding of risk is that, my gosh, we have a whole lot of work to do to really understand risk. And nowhere is that more important than supply chain risk management. I've talked a little bit about this lately, but we've got to be able to parse out what we're worried about more clearly in terms of our supply chain risk management efforts. It's about sharing information about risk and where the threat is. I think the best manifestation of this concept was in 2017 when Acting Secretary Duke issued a binding operational directive that required federal civilian agencies to remove Kaspersky Labs antivirus products from their networks. This is something that was the worst kept secret in town maybe, but nonetheless, the issue was that we had a company that had a product that was basically a rootkit that was operating below a level we typically monitor, scraping information, hypothetically sending back to Moscow that would then be subject to the military intelligence services of a nation state that has demonstrated ill will against the United States. So breaking this down into a framework allows us to really get a overly simplified, perhaps, but decent understanding of the way we can tackle this problem together. And that's, what is the thing? What's the thing? What is the product, the service, the solution, whatever? Where does it go? What does it have access to? What can it take? And then ultimately, who controls it? Who has ultimate authority over the access in the root level in the case of Kaspersky? And so Kaspersky was easy. It was antivirus, potentially sending information back to Moscow that could then be privy to the GRU, the FSB, SVR, you keep going. Because of the system of laws that an authoritarian state had implemented. So what really is this? This is weaponizing and operationalizing the tech sector. It's a pretty simple framework that we're going to continue to deploy across other sectors and other segments of the information and communications technology sectors. We can look at any country, any framework, any product through this lens, and it gives us a pretty good understanding of the things that we think we can tolerate and we can't. My authorities, though, are limited, in this case, to the federal civilian agencies. But if I've learned anything over the last 2 years, is when the Department of Homeland Security, when the federal government speaks and takes action, others listen. The private sector listens. State and local governments listen. Our partners in the international community want to work with us on these things. So in some cases, I've used this before, but it's the Spider-Man problem. With great power comes great responsibility. So we've got to be dead solid perfect every time. But we've got enough of an understanding, we have the authorities to engage and work with not just industry, but the intelligence community and law enforcement to get the job done to protect services on behalf of the American people, but also our allies and partners. Relatedly, election security. So I told you I'd come back to this. Election security is one of those things that I swear when I came in 2 years ago, I did not think I would be as engaged and travel as much international or global, domestically as I found myself in the run-up to 2018. I did not think that secretaries of state would have my phone number and would text me at all hours of the day and the night. But it happened, and I'm about to get a little blue here. I am very glad that we were able to engage and help out the state and local community to the extent we did in 2018. I think Matt Masterson's, if he hasn't already talked, today, but that guy is a national hero. Wherever he is, he put more time into supporting state and local governments on my team than I think, well, let's put it this way, I owe that guy a bunch of beers. So what we're doing right now, what we were able to do for 18 was work with all 50 states and over 1,400 local communities, local jurisdictions in the run-up to 18. But the challenge here is that there are 8,800 jurisdictions domestically. So we've got to figure out how to scale up to 8,800. We're going to continue to share information about the threat. We're going to continue to provide technical services, and we're going to continue to work on training, exercise, and other things. But this is not just a United States problem. This is a global problem. We continue to see Russia, we continue to see other countries engage in influencing and trying to interfere in elections. What I'm doing in the run-up to 2020, and perhaps General Hawke will talk about this a little bit later, but we are trying to understand what the adversary, in this case Russia, is doing elsewhere in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in other parts of the world, so that we can get inside their decision loop, so that we can understand what tools they're trying to develop. Sometimes they might not think we're watching or listening, but we are. And so I want to be able to take that understanding of tool sets and capabilities that they're road testing somewhere else, and I want to be able to bring that back here and help harden infrastructure and help take those avenues off the table. But it's also incumbent upon me, given we've got a track record of experience with election interference from the Russians, I need to be able to push that out and help my partners in Europe and elsewhere as they get ready for elections, whether it's EU parliamentary elections, snap elections, or otherwise. So we've got a lot of work to do, but if anything, if anyone in this room can agree on one thing, it's we need to protect democracy. And that for this room, for us, we're going to protect 2020. So that was my call when I was out at the RSA conference a couple weeks ago, or month or whatever it was. We are going to focus, and we're going to continue to focus on 2020, but we're ultimately focused on protecting democracy worldwide. And so I ask everybody in this room, whether it's here in the US or elsewhere, you can be part of this team. You can be part of this fight too. Engage, volunteer, participate, preach, whatever it is. We've got a job to do. There's no business motive here. It's protecting democracy, and if there's anything worth fighting for, it's probably that. So I know when to stop. So I'm going to stop on that. So I think we've got a few minutes of Q&A. I think Catherine's around here somewhere. No? Okay, that's right. She already told you how to do Q&A. Mics are open. Any questions? Come on. Oh, can we get a mic over here? And I apologize,
Thank you.
It's a little bright. I see some familiar faces. But
I'm a retired Senior Colonel Shu Weidi from China.
Yes, sir.
So I have two points. I'm not quite sure if I understand correctly. First one, you mentioned China did cyber attack on U.S. National critical infrastructure. I wonder, could you go further about that? Secondly, if my understanding is correctly, seems you want to kick China totally outside supply chain. Is that correct?
So let me start with your second point. I think what's going on right now, particularly domestically, but this is an international problem. I think, in an international economy, in a global economy, you have to look at all players through a certain lens, but certainly in the case of China, I think it's a market. There's no question it's a market, and people are going to chase the almighty dollar. They're also a partner from a supply chain perspective, whether it's manufacturing, designing, whatever. And then the third is, to answer your first question, Department of Justice indictment, I think Adam Hickey was here earlier, very clear in those indictments that nation-state actors, the Chinese state cyber actors, infiltrated U.S. domestic infrastructure for intellectual property theft. So what we have is a process where we have to balance critical infrastructure, domestic infrastructure has to balance risk and reward. If you want to go into this market, you have to be very transparent and eye-open. There's a series of laws in place, whether it's the cybersecurity law, the intelligence law. Ultimately, this is a country that has identified very clearly where they want to go in their Made in China 2025 plan of the strategic sectors that they want to invest in and be market players in. If you're a domestic infrastructure, if you're a US company, if you're any company that plays in any of those strategic sectors, you have a target on you. Manage risk accordingly. Any other questions?
In the
Yep.
In the Washington Post and New York Times in the past couple of months have been articles about the threat posed by principally students from the PRC at American universities. And of course, the universities in the United States are very, very dependent on grad students abroad. And I'm wondering what type of concrete programs are sort of addressing this issue, or at least thinking about this issue.
Yeah, so the Department of Justice and the intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence has been pretty out in front on this, engaging state and local partners. The way I look at it from the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency perspective is I want to be able to work with universities and their leadership, their boards, their rectors, whatever, and their chief information security officers to take the same approach that we're taking in the federal government that any sophisticated information security officer would take to understand what risk looks like. So from my perspective, it's R&D, federal R&D grants. It's private sector partnerships for R&D. Where does that information reside on the networks? Who has access to it? Just taking a high-value asset approach is one that can really start protecting the critical infrastructure, the information, the intellectual property that's being developed across colleges and universities, but ultimately understanding that the pure ethos of the American education system is one of openness, collaboration, but at some point, there has to be a recognition that there is research being conducted that is sensitive, that is funded by the Department of Defense, that is funded by the Department of Energy, that is funded by DHS, and there needs to be certain protections and controls put around that information. So what we've got to be able to do is provide that information security toolkit or chief information security officer in a box to help colleges and universities ensure that whatever that data is, it's protected where it resides. Yes,
my name is Liisa Past. I'm Estonian, and I do, amongst other things, election security. I couldn't agree more than with what you've ended up with. No, we need to share, and we need to share on a very practical level. However, what I've seen in my international work is that everyone agrees, but no one shows theirs first unless they see others first. To what degree would you be willing to share meaningful technical American information in real time or close to real time first, even if that means that, amongst allies, that allies would have understanding of your systems and configurations that not the public doesn't internationally.
Okay, so I think that the real rub here is that it doesn't matter what country you're in, every election system's different. I probably wouldn't wish the status or state of technology in the United States right now on anybody, but there is a whole lot of investment that has to happen in the U.S. to retire some of these legacy systems that are potentially vulnerable. From a information sharing perspective, particularly my team and what we do on risk assessments and understanding of where the risk resides within the election infrastructure, we tend to work as much as possible at the unclassified level, and so there should be very little barrier to entry in terms of sharing that. The intelligence community, that information sharing, that's obviously a more complicated conversation, but I think what we're seeing, particularly over the last 2 years, is an increased willingness and a quicker declassification or a quicker sharing timeline than probably has ever been in history of at least the intelligence community. So there's always going to be work to do here, but things are getting better, things are getting faster.
Hi, my name's Charles Yarbrough. I'm a student at JHU. I have two questions, very interrelated. First thing is regarding hardware. There are a lot of hardware that's made overseas, particularly China, and some of them may have backdoors or other access points for foreign intelligence. The second is the NSA, and other agencies are known to collect 0 days and hold on to them if necessary. Do you continue to do so to increase cooperation on security, or do you plan to keep storing essential 0 days?
So let me answer your first question first on hardware vulnerabilities. Look, I think supply chain in general as I mentioned, it's a thorny issue. It's really complicated to manage, but I think if we're talking about where the vulnerabilities are most likely to reside, it's probably in the software side rather than the hardware side. It just scales better, and it's not the smoking gun of the hardware side. But the key here is transparency in the process, transparency in the ownership of a company, transparency in control of a company, transparency in the process of testing and certification, so on and so forth. So it's what are those indicators of trust and transparency? On the 0 day side, look, we as the United States government have a vulnerability equities process and a disclosure program that, as far as I know, is the first really transparent process out there. I came from a company that's actually benefited probably from the intelligence community and others finding bad things and being provided that information to actually protect. So my sense of things is particularly when it comes to me and my agency, we are the advocate for the critical infrastructure community. We are the advocate for the private sector. So when these conversations happen about, well, there's this vulnerability, what do we do with it? I'm always going to be pushing to, hey, let's protect the ecosystem. One of those things that happened earlier this year was we issued an emergency directive, and this wasn't anything to do with the U.S. government, but we pushed out an emergency directive because of an ongoing DNS tampering campaign. And ultimately, my position on the campaign was this is global fabric of the internet type stuff. We've got to get out there and push capabilities or a warning and the things you can do to protect yourself. So that's always going to be my approach to problems.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right.
One more question, I think. Last one, quick.
No. Catherine's given me the no. So.
Sorry about that. You've got to stay on schedule. Sorry, Craig.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Thank you.